All right, so glad to be here today. Full disclosure, for those of you watching this is our children's building. So no, our sanctuary doesn't have a mural of Noah and the ark on the background for everybody to look at all the time. So just wanted to throw that out there. So the passage we're going to be talking out of today is kind of crazy how I came across it. It really just, it was one of those cases where it just kept coming up in my life for whatever reason. A lot of it was during Awana. For those of you who don't know what that is a program we do on Wednesday nights for our kids. It's split into 3 sections, 30 minutes each. One of them is big group time, and one of them is small group time where the kids are in their books and they have to memorize verses and stuff. And I lead the 3rd graders, and I also teach big group time for the 3rd through 5th grade. And in the small group time and in the big group time when I was preparing for the lessons and stuff, this passage kept coming up, and it was just, I couldn't understand why it just kept coming to me. And then we had Homiletics 201, and he told us you have to talk about a passage that is very familiar to you, and that's like, bam, that's why it's doing it. So, we're going to be in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. If y'all want to turn to that real quick, I'll give y'all just a second. Right, good, all right. So I'm going to read the whole thing. So here we go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man named John who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light who gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him. Yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us, and we observed his glory. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this day, this opportunity to come together in your name and talk about you and learn about you and read your word. I pray that you would speak through me, and that what I say is truth, and that you would reveal yourself to us during this time, and that we would grow closer to you, and that you would just continue to open our eyes. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. So, I'm going to start off with asking a question. And it's a rhetorical question. Just think about it for a second. So, when you're born, think of a couple of things that happens when you are born for the first time. So one of those things might be you take your first breath. That's one thing. There's a lot of things that actually happen. I could go into that in detail, but I'm not going to because I really don't want to. But there's 2 things that happen specifically that I want to focus on today. One of those things is you see for the first time. You see light, because where you just came from is pretty dark. And another thing that happens is you hear things, whether it be voices, noises, it could be doctors, it could be your mom, it could be your dad, it could be the noise of you screaming, because newborns normally scream a lot and they're loud. But those are the 2 things I want to focus on, and here's why. There's a biblical sense we get here based on what I'm talking about today, and it's that, number 1, the Word is revealed to us, and the light is also revealed to us. And we see the same thing when you're born. light and the Word revealed to us for the first time. So, moves us to our first point. And the first point is going to be in verses 1 through 5. I will reread those here in just a second. The first point is that the Word is mentioned in different contexts. And so what I mean is in the first 5 verses, the Word is actually talked about different ways. So let me read the first 5 verses again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him, and that life is the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness could not overcome it. So we got a couple of things there. We actually see him referred to 4 different ways here, but the first 2 kind of coincide with each other. So that would be the first point. In verses 1 through 2, we see that he is with God, and we also see that he was God. So this tells us 2 different things. Number 1, it shows us where he's been this whole time. For those of you wondering, did he have a beginning? Was he created? Was he on the earth when all this started? No, he was with God the whole time, up in heaven. And it also tells us who he is, and he is actually God. It connects him directly with God. And one of the things that the Bible doesn't actually mention, that is more of a human term, I guess is the best way to put it, would be the Trinity. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. It never actually calls it the Trinity. But this is kind of a picture that we're getting painted, that's being painted for us right now. Because it says he was with God and was God. And with God implies that he was in the presence of God, but at the same time he was God. So there's that Trinity aspect, which I'm not going to get into too much. Number 1, because it can be kind of confusing, even if you've studied the Bible your entire life. So I'm going to move to verse 3, and right there it tells us that he was the creator. And it says all things were created through him, nothing was created apart from him. That just really reaffirms his godship. And we know back in Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We know God is the ultimate creator. He created everything. And now it's telling us here that the Word, everything was created through the Word. That tells us that the Word is directly connected to God. So moving to verses 4 through 5, it says he was the light of men sent into darkness. And it actually, the first line in my translation, the first line on verse 4 is life was in him, which lets us know that he was alive. That's our first sign that this is a being. This isn't, a lot of people when they hear in the beginning was the Word, they think of spoken words, like what I'm speaking right now. But that's not actually what this is. This is an actual being. So we know that life was in him. We know he was alive. And we also know that he was the light. He was the light sent to us for some reason that we will get into later. Now, it also goes on to mention that darkness could not overcome it. Some other translations would be could not grasp it, could not comprehend it, could not overtake it. But the big idea here is to understand that it was more powerful than the darkness. And that is actually a reference to John chapter 12, verse 35. Give me just a second. Y'all don't have to flip there. I will flip there. John chapter 12, verse 35. This is very small print, so give me just a second. Okay, here we go. So this is Jesus talking to the disciples. He is predicting his crucifixion, and the disciples have just asked him, "Who is this Son of Man that you speak of?" And this is what Jesus said to them. Jesus answered, The light will be with you only a little longer. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness doesn't overtake you. The one who walks in darkness doesn't know where he's going." So from that we take that the light was given to us so that we could see through the darkness. So think about it this way. When you walk into a dark room, what's the first thing you do? You start looking for the light switch. Either you pull out your phone to turn on the flashlight app, if your phones have that, or you start feeling around for a light switch. And most people, including myself, if I don't find a light switch, there's a good chance I'm not going in that room because I can't see. We need the light to direct us through the darkness. And it's important that what we're reading here is that it also says we can only see the light if we walk with it. If we're not walking with the light, then we can't see it and we are in darkness. It's not really a good place to be. So that actually brings me to my next main point, which is the word was rejected by the world and his own people. And that's going to be verses 6 through 11. I'm going to read those again, just so we have it fresh on our minds. So verses 6 through 11 in chapter 1. There was a man named John who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. So that's pretty sad that his own people didn't receive him. We'll get to that in just a second. So what we take from the previous point and John 12:35 is that the word was rejected because the people were blind, because they couldn't see the light. They were in the darkness. They couldn't see the light, so they rejected it. So the first couple of verses of this particular section takes a little bit of it changes gears for just a second to mention a new character, and that character would be, it just says John, but we would later learn that it's John the Baptist was his name. It says he was sent as a witness to testify about the light. So we know that later on John the Baptist was sent to, for a lack of a better phrasing, pave the way for Jesus' ministry. He would be the one to introduce him to the people, sort of. So it switches gears here, but it also mentions that John was sent by God, meaning that he had a specific purpose, and his purpose was to testify about this light that was coming. And it stops with emphasizing that John wasn't the light. This is important because before Jesus came, there was a lot of people who thought John the Baptist was the Messiah. A lot of people who followed him as if he was, but John even tells us himself, I baptize you with water, but the one that comes after me, he baptizes with the Spirit. I'm unworthy to tie his sandals. So even John himself recognizes he's just a little human. He is not this light to come. So moving to verse 9, it says, the Word was the light sent into the world to give light to everyone. That's not what the verse says, that's what I said. And it's kind of wordy, and so I'm going to say that one more time. The Word was the light sent into the world to give light to everyone. So we see here where God has sent the Word into the world for everyone. Everyone is receiving this light, or well, they're not receiving it yet, but God has sent it for them to receive. And also, it says was coming. It emphasizes here was coming. It's important to realize that these first 14 verses are not happening as this particular author, which we believe to be John, not John the Baptist, John the half-brother. But this is actually a flashback to before we were ever created, as of verse 1 where it says in the beginning. So this is setting up the first coming. At this point, we kind of get a glimpse that the Word is most likely Jesus Christ. Actually, we would know for a fact that it is with prior knowledge and of the rest of the Bible. But as of right now, it has not confirmed that, but for us, we would know that. So moving to verses 10 through 11, it says, the world did not recognize him. not even his own people. So at this point, verse 10 in my translation, the first line in verse 10 is he was in the world. So at this point, he's here. And he is doing all his things just at this particular point in time that it's referencing to. It also goes on to, I'm sorry, I just lost my voice. Okay, so moving to the next one. It says the world rejected him, including his own people. Now this is significant because it'd be one thing if people who didn't have any clue about him, or at least the Messiah, Son of God, would reject him. That makes a little bit more sense than his own people reject him. And here's why. His own people were the Jews, Jewish people. Well, in their belief system, the Messiah, or Son of God, the one to come, they're looking for him. They were looking for him. They were waiting on him. They still are today. That's the sad part. They're still waiting on the Messiah. They're waiting on the one that will come to fulfill the covenant made between God and Moses back in the Old Testament. And Jesus came. We know that that one to come was Jesus, but they still rejected him. And they did that because they didn't recognize him, and they were blind to him. That makes me think of a story. My first job that I ever got was working at a Subway restaurant not far from here. Terrible job, couldn't stand it, but it is what it is. First job, I was fresh out of high school. I didn't really care. The biggest reason why I didn't like it was because of the owner. He wasn't the easiest guy to work with. Just if I'm being honest, he was a pretty big jerk. Not gonna lie, he was not a good guy. I was the only Christian that worked there, and I didn't really suffer any hardship because of it. But everybody knew where I stood, including him. And sometimes he would try to argue with me about biblical stuff. But this one particular time, I don't remember exactly how the conversation started, but this is what he said to me. If there is a God, then I've seen him. If there is a God, then I've seen him. I looked at him and I said, what? He said, if there is a God, then I've seen him. I said, you're going to have to explain that one to me, because I have no clue what that's supposed to mean. If there's a God, you have seen him. So he goes on to talk about how he had a family member of some sort. It's been a long time since this happened, so I don't remember exactly every detail. But he goes on to say how a family member of his was either sick or dying or needed to have some sort of surgery, and he was worried about them. And then he went to sleep one night and he said he had this dream of this figure. Didn't say what it was, human, whatever, a figure standing in front of him, and that figure looks at him and says, don't worry, she's going to be okay. And then they find out later that she's going to be just fine. So that's him saying to me, if there is a God, I've seen him, because he thought that that figure was either A, God, or B, an angel sent by God. But his comment of, if there's a God, then I've seen him, tells me a different story. Let me say this. If you can look at me and say, if there is a God, then I've seen him, and honestly believe that, if there is a God, then I've seen him, I can guarantee you, you have not seen him. If you haven't seen him, then you're not going to think there's a God. If you have seen him, there's no question of if there's a God. If you've seen him, then there's a God. I'm assuming that everybody in this room and everybody watching this, that they have seen him and they know there's a God. Because, I mean, I've seen things that have happened that I'm like, That wasn't supposed to happen. There's no way that should have happened. And I know it did happen because I know there's a God. So if you have the mindset of if there's a God, you haven't seen him. It's very obvious if you have or have not seen God. So this moves us to our final point, and it is in verses 12 through 14. And it says, some did receive him, and those who did receive him were changed by him. So now we see where if you are receiving him, there's a change there. And going back to that story I just told, he may have seen him. If there is a God, I saw him, but there is no change. Number one, you can't even confirm if you actually saw him. Number two, there's obviously no change in your life. Well, this right here just said, well, if you have seen him, received him, then you've changed. There's some sort of change that takes place. So this is verses 12 through 14. Let me read them real quick. This is the last 3 verses. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed his glory. So first thing, in verse 12, he gave those who received him the right to be called God's children. So the emphasis I want to put on this is that we are receiving the right. We didn't earn it. We can't pay for it. We didn't do anything to deserve it, but it was just given to us. If we receive him, we have to receive him to become children of God. So moving to verse 13, it says, those who were born of God were made his children. It talks about you can't be born of blood, flesh, or man, and you have to be born of God to be his children. So I'm assuming that everybody in here and watching that we know what it means to be born of God, but just in case somebody does happen to stumble across this that doesn't know what that means, this is a spiritual birth. This is not an actual physical birth. And if you ever hear a Christian in church or something say, oh, you have to be born again, this is what we're talking about. You have to be born again spiritually, meaning now you live for God instead of live for sin and what we used to live for the first time we were born. So, and this is kind of funny because it means this really tells us that you could be the best person in the world. It doesn't matter if you don't live for God, if you're not born of God. It reminds me of another story. When I was probably around 15, maybe 14 or 15, I was at home watching TV, and we had just gotten HBO. And I thought that was cool. You know, no commercials, movie channels, a couple good TV shows. So I was just flipping through one day. I wasn't really paying attention to the guide or anything. I was just flipping through, and I came across this one program, and it was a guy interviewing a girl. And the first thing I thought was, okay, this is some sort of like documentary or something, and she's involved in it somehow. Didn't know how. That's all I knew. First thing I hear is the guy asked the girl, do you think you'll go to heaven? Well, I stopped clicking through the channels because I wanted to see what she was going to say. That kind of caught my attention. And this is what she says to him. She says, yeah, I'll go. I know for a fact I'll go to heaven because I'm a good person and because I'm nice to people and I don't do the wrong things and I don't hurt people. Like, well, that's not really the right answer that you want to hear when you ask if you'll go to heaven. But I was just curious as to exactly what was going on. So on the remote, there's a little button that says info, and if you press info, it brings up this box and it tells you the title of the show and the information of the show and just tells you what's going on. So I pulled it up, and I don't remember the title, but basically it was a documentary about an ex-porn star. So immediately I turned the channel. Because I was like, I mean, for those of you who have HBO or heard of it, some of the things on there can get pretty rough. So as soon as I said that, I was clicking that button. I was out of there. That's not happening. Before anything gets on this TV screen that I definitely don't want to see, we are out of here. We are out. But think about that for a second. I know that's a weird illustration to use, but think about that for a second. We have a person sitting here saying they're going to go to heaven because they're a good person and they don't do anything wrong. Meanwhile, they're an ex-porn star. That's not how that works. Now, I do want to say this for a second. I'm not trying to stand up here and be judgmental. I don't want to sit up here and say, all of you people that are bad, you're going to go to hell, and this is why. I'm not saying that, because I do believe that salvation is available to anybody at any time. But if that's your mindset, then we have a problem. If your mindset is, I'll go to heaven because I'm a good person, you're in for a rude awakening. Because if that is her mindset right now, I'll tell you this, you're not going to go to heaven. And it's not because you weren't a good enough person, and it's not even because of the things you've necessarily done in your past. The main reason you're not going to go is because you don't know God. And it's because you were not born of God. You haven't been changed by Him, you haven't received Him, and you are not born of God. You are still born of the flesh. So, moving on to the last verse, verse 14. It's a short verse, but I split it up into two sections, 14a and 14b. So I'm going to read 14a just real quick. It says, "The Word became flesh and took up residence among us." So basically, the Word became flesh and He dwelt among us. So in this particular passage, this is our first confirmation that this is Jesus Christ we're talking about. We know this because we know that Jesus is God in the flesh. All fully God, fully human. God became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Jesus Christ. This is the first confirmation we have of that. So also it tells us that He dwelt among us, which means that He lived with us, He walked with us, He was here, He was on the earth, He felt what we felt, He saw what we saw, He went through what we went through, what we experienced as humans, He experienced the same thing. So that moves us to 14b, and it's just, we observed His glory as the one and only Son from the Father. Yes, we observed His glory from the one and only Son as from the Father. So, 2 points here. Number one, I want to emphasize that the we that it's talking about here is believers. If you're not a believer, then you're not going to see His glory. You're not going to recognize Him as the Son of God because you don't believe in it. Which is, it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if I don't believe in something, I'm not going to have faith in it. I'm not going to recognize whatever it is. And also, this reaffirms to us that He is the one and only Son of God. He is the one that the Jews have been waiting for, that they've been looking for, the one to fulfill that covenant with Abraham. He is the one. He is God, sent from heaven to bring light into our world. So, I want to close with this. I want to close with asking a question, and that question is, do you know this Word? Do you know the Word? Because if you don't know who the Word is, then you're not going to know what this Word says. If you don't know who the Word is, which we know now that the Word is Jesus Christ, so let me just start saying it that way. If you don't know Jesus Christ, I could stand up here all day. I could tell y'all scripture after scripture. I could tell you truth after truth. I could smack you in the face with my Bible. I could do all of it all day. And it's not going to change anything. It's not going to mean anything to you. because you haven't seen it. You don't know it. It would literally be like me going to a foreign country and getting a person who doesn't speak English, has never heard English, and has never actually seen English words written, and handing them an English dictionary. Not an English dictionary that translates, like the Spanish to English translations or English to Spanish, something like that. Not like that. Just a regular English dictionary that just English words. That'd be like me handing it to them and saying, here, just read this. It'll all make sense. Don't worry about it. Just read that. It's all going to make sense. I promise. Well, number one, they're not going to understand what I just said if they don't speak English. And number two, even if they do somehow decipher that I told them to open this book and read it, they're going to start looking at it and they're not going to have a clue as to what it says because they don't understand it. They've never seen it before. They've never heard it before. They don't understand it because it is not familiar to them. So I say that to say this. Before we can know what the Bible says, we have to know who the Word is. We have to know Jesus Christ. I'm not saying that it's not important to read the Bible. It's very important to read the Bible. And I'm not saying that you should not read the Bible. But I'm saying if you don't understand what it's saying, or if you don't know who God is, it doesn't matter what it says to you because you're not going to follow it. If you don't know who Jesus is, you're probably not going to read it anyway. But for those who think they know who he is and are reading it, but they can't understand why they don't get it right, well, it's probably because you don't know who Jesus is. So I would invite you, if you don't know who he is, to just throw yourself at his feet. Because I believe in a God of mercy and love, and I believe that if we throw ourselves at his feet, he will reveal himself to us.